Well, thanks very much, Steve. I'm amazed to hear that the Petroleum Association is promoting climatism. I mean, I could understand that they might want to take a neutral position and just say, oh, well, as responsible citizens, we'll follow whatever laws there are and, we'll be a good citizen. But to actually help feed the fire that's threatening to burn down their house, I mean, this is really a bad PR strategy, and obviously somebody's going to have to relook at it, especially as more and more of their stockholders come to understand that it's probably not true at all. Anyway, I now have the privilege of introducing Dr. Harrison Schmitt. He's the only geologist to actually conduct in situ sample collection while actually standing on the moon. Okay? I'm sure... Well, I know you've done many interesting and exciting things in your career. Actually walking on another celestial body, that must have really topped them all. Like most teenagers in those days, I really wanted to walk on the moon too. In fact, I wanted to go to Mars. I still remember Spiro Agnew, Vice President Agnew, saying, "Why wait? We can be on Mars in '88. I still have that headline at home. Well, I think that might have been a bit of an exaggeration. I think perhaps going back to the moon and getting a little more comfortable there, and long-duration space flights perhaps a little shorter than Mars might be the way to go. But I think it's a real tragedy that your flight, Apollo 17, was the last time that humans actually have walked on another celestial body in more than 2 generations. I think it's about time we got moving again. Harrison Schmitt is a former United States Senator from New Mexico, as well as a geologist, and as I said, a former Apollo 17 astronaut. He currently is an aerospace, earth science, and private enterprise consultant. Dr. Schmitt is a member of the new Committee of Correspondence and the Heartland's Board of Directors. He is the principal author of posts on the American Uncommon Sense website, including a series of essays on, quote, climate and the Constitution, and this was posted on that website earlier this week. So I'm very happy to introduce Apollo 17 astronaut, Dr. Schmitt.
Well, thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to once again be with you. I am not going to apologize for being the second geologist to talk to you today. The more the merrier, we always say, particularly over a beer or two. And I'm also a space guy, Larry, as you well know, so I feel in great company here. This discussion will be largely in the context of American constitutional perspectives, as you will see. But I think the concepts certainly are universal. The constitutional limitations that politicians should be considered being faced with are several. There are no enumerated provision within the Constitution that specifically or in general terms gives Congress, the executive, or the judiciary the power over climate. That fact seems to be lost, but nevertheless it's a truism. The general welfare provision, for example, that you find in Article 1 has no context other than those related to the 17 enumerated powers of the Congress of the United States. The Commerce Clause, one of those 17 clauses, is often cited as providing unlimited congressional authority and federal government authority, but it literally, from the founder's perspective, is limited to making commerce between the states regular or non-discriminatory. It did not involve regulation of operations of regular commerce. Such regulation would be unconstitutional except where operations would violate other constitutional provisions, particularly those in the Bill of Rights. The endangerment of the 9th Amendment, an often forgotten amendment of the Constitution, which codifies the natural rights of Americans, its citizens, such as life, for example, are not proven. There's no endangerment of life that has been proven by the science or otherwise. Unlike an epidemic, there you see that the endangerment clearly exists and the federal government would have a role in dealing with epidemics, that certainly those that cross state boundaries. The constitutional limitations continue in that federal regulation and taxing of carbon emissions are even more specifically unconstitutional. Article 1 in the provision for common defense and general welfare, which the 17 clauses refer to in Section 8, are inhibited by limitations on economic growth and energy supply. That is, our national security, the so-called common defense, is clearly inhibited if we do not have energy supplies and economic growth that provide for that common defense. The Fourth Amendment provides equal protection, and if you're going to try to regulate some carbon sources, clearly equal protection is not provided to all other, to those carbon sources if others are not regulated, and regulating all sources of carbon dioxide in particular would be clearly impossible. The Ninth Amendment again comes in here because absent demonstrable harm to other citizens, these natural rights are reserved to the people, and particularly there are many, but those that are inherently part of being a human being, but liberty, property, and travel are the ones that are particularly affected. And the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, where non-enumerated powers of the Constitution are reserved to the states, clearly is relevant in this context. Now, there are two scientific hypotheses, as has been mentioned in various forms already at this conference. Certainly, one of them is human activity causes the modern continuation of about 350 years of slow warming of the atmosphere. Scientists and the scientific establishment, dependent on government funding, are the principal advocates of this hypothesis. Again, we think testable, and the Bob Carter's discussion this morning certainly helped very much in outlining that testable concept. The other alternative hypothesis, of course, is that natural processes lie behind this modern continuation of 350 years of slow warming, which, as we now know, appears to have at least temporarily been terminated. And that's largely independently funded and observational scientists that are pushing this, as is manifested particularly in this conference. Now, there is a room between these two hypotheses, probably only at the margins, and let's examine that a little bit. But first of all, let's look at why we are having such a hard time, in fact, an impossible time, apparently, to gather normal scientific or common sense debate with the alarmists. Certainly the fear of losing research funding and colleague approval is a major factor, I think, in this. Fear of character assassination by government officials, politicians, and the media is probably also a factor, unspoken. I just went through that in New Mexico for a few months while I was trying to help that state out. But it's not uncommon to see that happen, and it affects not only individuals, but often affects families. Acceptance of establishment media allegations of scientific consensus, that's an easy thing to do. We've seen it again and again in geology, and I'm sure in other sciences. I'm dealing with that right now and have been for several decades. The so-called consensus among my colleagues that the moon formed by a giant impact of a Mars-sized object on the Earth. That is a model-based hypothesis that I think can be tested and fails test, but not all of my colleagues, of course, agree. So we have to watch that continually in science. It's a very easy thing to get into, as Fred Singer knows, is to accept consensus as fact rather than as a hypothesis. Ideological belief by much of academia, and Steve has just outlined that in remarkable ways and in his book, that ideological belief is not only a belief in climatism, but it's a belief in National Socialist control of economics. And we have to remember that this is a stalking horse for National Socialism, whether they will call it that or not. Decades of ideological capture of young minds through what I now call the polar bear indoctrination It could be the rainforest indoctrination. Many names can be applied to this. But nevertheless, that is a very, very serious problem, and it lies at the root, maybe, of what we're dealing with today, and that has to do with the capture of the education system. And avoidance of objective teaching of principles of scientific inquiry, particularly in the advanced education institutions of this country and clearly elsewhere in the world. Now, what is the plausibility of government action dealing with these two hypotheses? If the human cause hypothesis is correct, then the cost and regulation of any plausible actions violate Article 1 and the Ninth Amendment's protections of liberty, pursuit of happiness, travel, property, and probably all other natural rights protected by the Ninth Amendment. Energy and economic losses undercut constitutional requirement to provide for the common defense, as I already mentioned. Now, if natural causes hypothesis is correct, regulation and taxation can have no plausible mitigation effects other than economic decline, as was mentioned yesterday. Obviously, theoretically, you could deal with natural causes by totally eliminating that small amount of carbon dioxide that is produced by humans, but you would not have much effect on that's being produced naturally. Mitigation of significant adverse effects might be technically plausible, but most of them probably not affordable, at least over short periods of time. Now, major problems faced by the human cause climate hypothesis have been mentioned in many different contexts. I'll go through them very quickly. I think the primary one is that there's been, in my estimation, 350 years of slow natural warming since the last cold minimum of the Little Ice Age. That clearly, most of that time is independent of fossil fuel use. About a half a degree, some people say a degree centigrade, and others will say no degree centigrade, but still a little bit of warming seems to have been going on for that 350 years, half a degree per 100 years. So there's a strong correlation of climate change with historical and modern solar activity indices. In the last 2,000 years, for example, we've had the Little Ice Age and the 11-year solar cycle fairly well correlated, not caused necessarily, but correlated with solar activity indices. And as we learned at a couple of conferences ago, if you do a statistical analysis, about 79% of solar variation correlates with changes in climate, short-term climate, versus about 22% for carbon dioxide variation. Changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide lag rather than lead temperature changes in temperature. That's increasingly well documented. The atmospheric steady state concentration of fossil fuel isotopes may be only 4% based on carbon isotope mass balance analysis. Tom Segelstad presented that at the last conference, and I think has to be looked at very, very closely. This is a very important, I think, area of geochemistry that is probably being neglected far too much. And if true, where is the rest of the fossil fuel carbon dioxide? Well, I strongly suspect it's in the oceans, that the oceans are perfectly capable, as we see, of absorbing that amount of carbon dioxide. A rapid rate of exchange of atmospheric carbon with the ocean reservoirs geologically has been well documented for many, many decades, particularly since the nuclear testing activity after World War II. That is about 5 to 10 years, maybe you might say a half-life of 5 years, rather than the 50 to 200 years and sometimes 1,000 years that is claimed on the other side of this question. The extraordinary capacity of the oceans to absorb, transport, and release or fix carbon. Both processes are going on, and more recently, reports, even by people who are advocates of the alarmist position, their observations are beginning to show the Southern Ocean has begun to release carbon dioxide. Now, the additional problems, extraordinary capacity of oceans not only to store carbon dioxide, but to store and transport, release heat, as we discussed yesterday. Global circulation models, incorrect predictions for terrestrial and tropospheric temperature change certainly is a major problem for the human-caused hypothesis. And fraudulent presentation of data for global temperature and carbon dioxide trends means that you have to ask the question, what can we trust? Can we trust the modern temperature records or the models themselves for purposes outside of what models really are useful for, as Bob Carter discussed this morning? Major support for natural climate hypotheses, of course, are the historical and geological records and the increasingly plausible hypothesis of cosmic ray amplification of solar activity variations. Now, politics may be moving in the direction of scientific sanity, but particularly regulation is not. And that's what we have to now be much concerned about on the political sphere, is the encroachment of regulations. The future, well, recapture of the K through 12 schools and media-based continuing education systems, I think, is number one. We've got to go to work on that, whether you're in the political sphere or the scientific sphere. That is where we lost the battle, at least temporarily, and that has to be taken care of. Develop non-governmental sources to fund climate research, observation, and debate, clearly critical to our cause. Focus government funding on objective data gathering. There's nothing wrong with government research as long as it is indeed follows the scientific method and is objective. Develop allies in scientific fields that understand the limitations of modeling. There are those, particularly in the astrophysics community, that also question the use of modeling for prediction, as many of you are aware. Vigorously defend against character assassination of those who advocate objective science. You wouldn't be here if you weren't willing to defend that, because I think most of us have been subject to those kinds of vilifications. Work to inform and assist like-minded candidates in the upcoming elections, clearly very important. Well, have a great 4th, folks. Remember what Americans celebrate. It's good for all of us.